Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Oleksandra, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukraine Media Center today. It's been 11 years of the war. It's been almost 3 years of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor, and today we have gathered you to discuss the act of terrorism that has taken place in Olenivka. The topic of today's briefing is from Olenivka to The Hague, who will be held accountable for the treacherous killing of the Ukrainian POWs, and we will discuss the act of terrorism that has taken place in the year 2022 in the night of the 29th of July. It was aimed against the Ukrainian prisoners of war, and there in the territory of the former number 120 Olenivka prisoner camp was located. So what do we know for the time being? Unfortunately, 53 prisoners of war have died and about 140 more were injured as a result of this act of terrorism. According to the information from the Russians, the total number of the people kept in that barracks was 193. So let's talk about the fact that we were able to establish, that our civil sector was able to establish about the national investigation. Let's talk more about those involved in the crime and the cooperation with the International Criminal Court on this track. So let me introduce the speakers. Joining us today are Martynovskyi, senior expert of the Regional Center for Human Rights. Also joining us is Tetiana Katrychenko, executive director of the Media Initiative for Human Rights. Also joining us is Oleksandra, Mazur, head of the Olenivka Community NGO. Also joining us is Dmytro Martsyn, Prosecutor of the 18th Department of the Prosecutor General's Office, and Tsyb, representative of the 18th Department of the General Prosecutor's Office. Good morning, dear friends. Thank you for joining us today. So, Mr. Roman, let's start with you. What have you been able to establish? What are the facts that you've investigated? What have the civil organizations have investigated? And obviously, let's talk about your appeal to ICC. So what is the phase? Where are we currently staying? Good morning, dear friends, dear colleagues. Thank you for your interest to this event. Yes, really, on the 10th of December last year, we've handed over to the ICC a report that I'm about to tell you about. And I would like to start with what we were thinking in the morning, what have we been experiencing in the morning of the 29th of July 2022. This morning will be remembered by a lot of us for forever. That morning was accompanied by different messages in the mass media, in the social networks, and the blood was getting cold in our veins because dozens of our prisoners of war, our military who were kept prisoners in the so-called Olenivka camp, were treacherously and ruthlessly killed by the Russian agents. The terrible crime and the names of those who should be held accountable are still unknown to us, and basically our joint investigation didn't allow us to come closer to those who were directly involved in this terrible crime. But today we will discuss other persons who are one way or another responsible for what happened in the Olenivka camp in the night of the 28-29 July 2022. So this report was jointly developed by a number of the civil organizations, including 4 Ukrainian and 2 foreign. One of them is French and another one is Dutch. During our work, we were in close cooperation with the Office of the Prosecutor General, and we were using the information that we got from the Office of Prosecutor General under lawful procedure to reinforce our evidence base and our arguments. Minute by minute, we reestablished the chronology of the events of the 28th and 29th of July 2022. To do this, we were using the evidences of the witnesses of the crime, witnesses of those events, as well as materials of the journalist investigations. And I would like to thank the Media Initiative for Human Rights, who are the co-authors of this report, as well as Kyiv Independent, whose materials we were using in our reports. So the version of events set forth in our report looks just like this. We've drawn attention of the Prosecutor of the ICC to the treatment of our prisoners of war by the agents of Russian Federation, both to those held in the Olenivka camp and in other places of detention in the temporarily occupied territories and in the territory of Russian Federation. And those facts, they evidence the policy of torture established by the Russian government, the policy that was strictly formulated and that has become systemic on the level of the top-level governance. The events that have unfolded in Olenivka camp are the direct consequences of this policy. One of the coincidences is one coincidence is just a coincidence, but many coincidences may become an evidence of the systemic nature of events. So the arrival of Colonel Kirill Popov to the occupied territory of the nation on the 16th of May 2022, on that very same day when our defendants started walking out of Azovstal, it could be considered a coincidence, but further events evidence that it's not just a coincidence. Popov is called the commander of the group of forces of the Federal Enforcement Service in the so-called DPR. He was staying in the temporarily occupied territory for a month. He was visiting Olenivka camp, and he was meeting Yuri Doroshenko, the head of the Federal Enforcement Service, and he was quite actively communicating with the management of the Federal Enforcement Service. In July 2022, the personnel of the prisoner camps started re-outfitting one of the barracks, and on the 27th of July, about 200 of our defenders who were held captive there were moved to that barrack, where no even sleeping bunks were properly equipped. The mattresses and the pillows were brought in the barracks for that whole day, and the number of bunks was so huge that they were densely placed in the barracks that created obstacles as the prisoners were trying to escape the barracks during the fire. Also, on the same day, a person with the call sign Hunter was present during the formation, and the prisoners somehow associated his appearance with the intensification of tortures. The prisoners of war were prohibited to leave the barracks, and it was left under the supervision of only one sentinel who was assigned out of the number of other prisoners of war, which was a not characteristic feature. About 2,300 the prisoners of war have heard the sounds which were similar to the launches of Grad rockets, and at the same time 2 explosions sounded near the barracks. So the launches from Grad MLRS were intended to overlap the sounds of explosions that were taking place in the barracks, and the sequence of explosions evidence that thermobaric weapons were used of a Schmill type, which resulted in intense fire in the barracks. The temperature in the epicenter of explosion could reach 1500 degrees centigrade. As a result of the explosion, at least 53 prisoners of war were killed including 9 who have died outside the barracks due to the lack of proper medical aid. It has become a consequence of prohibition by the colony's administration to enter the colony for the ambulances, and they have not only failed to organize the aid to those wounded, but they've also prohibited the Ukrainian medics held captive there to provide medical help to the wounded warriors. This is why we want to emphasize that the majority of the victims have died due to the failure to provide medical aid. On that very same day, Popov, the above Popov, has become 44 years old. That was his birthday. He was the head of enforcement service of DPR, and he was staying in the territory of the Donetsk region for a month after our defenders of Azovstal have left their positions. After that, we focused our attention on identification of persons who can be held accountable for this crime. We focused all of our efforts on identification of persons who may be held accountable for death and torture of Ukrainian prisoners of war based on the principle of responsibility of commanders. You may hear this term command responsibility, but we use the term responsibility or liability of commanders as it's set forth in the Rome Statute. Based on that principle, those commanders who failed to stop the crime knowingly or failed to hand over any information about it to the relevant authorities are criminally liable. And we think that Yuri Doroshenko, the then director of the enforcement service of the so-called DPR, who was the curator of the administration of Olenivka camp, he was the one meeting Popov Kirill, and he was also the one responsible for proper conditions of handling in compliance with the Geneva Convention, and he was the one who was responsible for the internal investigation to have the case handed over to the competent authorities for further investigation. And the other 3 persons are the commanders of the Federal Enforcement Service, Arkady Gostyev, his deputy, first deputy, Valery Boyarinov, his deputy, Rustam Stepanenko, and they are the persons with whom Kirilo Popov was in maintaining active ties using his telephone, and those persons were responsible for proper investigation and for making sure the persons are established, their identities are established, and their whereabouts are handed over to the relevant investigation authorities. And I've already described the role of Kirilo Popov. So now let's discuss the heads of the investigation committee, Oleksandr Bastrykin, and his deputy Konstantin Korpusov, who is the head of the military investigation department of Russian Federation, who is the head of the so-called investigation of killings in Olenivka. I would like to give more details here. Those persons are responsible not only for failure to provide proper or to organize proper investigation, but they're also liable for falsification of evidences at the site. The fact that their subordinates never communicated with the crime victims and they've only checked one version, the guilt of armed forces of Ukraine, which is the evidence that they have not properly investigated the crime. And also among the guilty parties, we also call Sergei Surovikin, a famous butcher who was the commander of the armed forces of Russian Federation in that region. And he was responsible for use of all of the technical capabilities by the Russian forces in violation of Article 1 of Geneva Convention. Surovikin never organized any proper investigation of the use of the thermobaric weapons by his subordinates. And 2 months after the killing of our prisoners of war in Olenivka, Surovikin was promoted and appointed head of all of the branches and forces in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, which is the evidence of the direct support of Surovikin's activities by Putin. So basically, the liability for such crimes is contemplated by the Article 8 of the Rome Office and in our Rome Statute, and in our report we're urging the ICC to use all of its capabilities to ensure that the guilty ones are being held liable. We are sure that killing and torture of the prisoners of war who are protected by Geneva Convention, the crime that impresses with its cynicism, a crime that has been never seen since the World War II, has no statute of limitation and should be punished. Reconstruction of events in Olenivka is another evidence that Russian Federation remains Moscovia of the Horde times, and Muscovites, they remain Muscovites. Thank you, Mr. Roman. Tetiana, we know that Media Initiative for Human Rights also investigates the crimes of the Russians quite intensely and thoroughly. Probably you have something to add? Well, I'm going to be brief today. Thank you very much for your attention, that your attention to this topic never wanes, and it gives me reasons to assume that those who are supposed to be held accountable will eventually end up in the dock. Well, Media Initiative for Human Rights in the spring 2023 started investigating the circumstances of explosions in Olenivka jointly with the families of Olenivka relatives, with the representatives of the relatives of Azov Brigade. We were trying to investigate all of the circumstances of the crime. We were knowing about the fact of the crime. Also, the investigation has started, but dozens of families of the dead and wounded warriors were never involved in that process. So on the first phases, we were trying to collect all of the information that we could. We were trying to get the families together, so it's easier to find out the circumstances. Well, you know, we have certain interest to the places of detention. It has not started with the full-scale invasion. We were doing this job of investigating those places in temporarily occupied territories. We were aware of Olenivka as a place of concentration of prisoners of war. It was in the focus of our attention. We were starting with a lot of civilians who were detained there for so-called screening measures. Some people were detained there for long terms. So it was a first investigation when we were able to find out who the managers of the colony are. We were able to find a person, to call his name. And on the second phase, we focused on the investigation of the circumstances of explosion. Is it safe to say that we're in the middle of our investigation? No, not really so, because a lot of circumstances were not found out. For example, we don't know based on what the list of the prisoners were put together, based on what principles certain military, certain servicemen were brought to that barracks specifically. We don't know what kind of weapon was exactly used, who was launching the weapon, and who has given the order. But after a year and a half of the investigation, we don't leave it. We continue working with our colleagues. We're having a hope that sooner or later this case that was really very, very difficult in the beginning, we were realizing that we are never not going to get access to the site. A lot of witnesses are disoriented due to the circumstances of explosion, but still there is a hope to identify not only the course of actions, not only the chronology, but also to realize who exactly was putting those lists together, what was the reason to put those lists together, who was bringing the people to that barracks, and then eventually who either launched a projectile or who set up a bomb there. I hope we will find out eventually. And now we're having another investigation, the fall of Ilyushin-76 aircraft in Belgorod region of Russia. It's also another case of killing of multiple prisoners of war in the territory under the control of Russian Federation. So, in our opinion, the responsibility is on the Russian side. So I'm convinced that journalist investigations are very important in the course of our investigation. We can go further. We can use the methods that the journalists usually use, and hopefully those investigations will be useful for the criminal investigation, and we are ready to cooperate. Thank you, Ms. Tetiana, Mr. Oleksandra. Let me ask you, based on the information that we have, we know that they were the representatives of the Azov Brigade, I mean those who were brought to those barracks, and talking about bringing back of those who ended up in the epicenter of this act of terrorism. What do we know about those whom we were able to bring back? Do we know anything about the condition of those who are still remaining in the enemy's captivity? Well, first of all, I would like to thank everybody here, those who are curious about this topic, those who work on it, because us as a community, we've gathered in the beginning of the year 2023. Even in the mass media, there was not so much information about that mass execution. And back then, it seemed that nobody is curious, nobody is interested to find out more. And now we're at another phase. The experts are working on this case. They use serious methods. The people who are joining me here and the representatives of other organizations, they conduct their investigation on a quality level, given their limited capabilities, given the fact that a lot of the prisoners of war who survived this mass execution are still in captivity. And answering to your question, how are they doing in their captivity? I have no answer to this. Not even the families are aware of that. Sometimes as people get exchanged, they tell us that they've seen somebody in captivity, say it was like 3 or 6 months ago, and we know that that person at least was alive back then, but it gives us no information about the health condition of that person or the condition of their captivity. And when it comes to the exchanges, I don't want to pretend that we have any influence over the process of the exchanges as a civil organization. My advice to the journalist is to ask the coordination headquarters. They will give you relevant advice and consultation. We are involved in information work on Olenivka case. We cooperate with everybody, civil rights organizations, journalists. We work with the artists as well. You can see here on our announcement a logo, a tree. It was created by Tsyb, Union of Artists with whom we cooperate, and the journalists who frequently cover the Olenivka case. Well, basically we unite the people around this topic. We are the representatives of the families of those who died, of those who survived and have already come back or is still staying in captivity. So now we're at another quality level, and I cannot say it makes me happy, but still I have some internal tranquility because I see the case moving, I see the international experts involved, and now we're moving to a whole different quality level again. Mr. Ramon, let me ask you about the national investigation. It's still underway, but what are the intermediate results? What is its condition for the time being? Who can start? Good morning. Well, talking about the national investigation, we're approaching it in a complex manner. We investigate all of the evidences that we are able to. We've divided the process into two blocks. First is what was going on during the explosions, what was the kind of weapon used, who were the persons involved, and another block is the circumstances that were unfolding right after the explosions. Well, we need to mention that the investigation was really complicated by the fact that we cannot get to the site. We cannot even identify the type of weapon that was used. It's really difficult because we have no access. We cannot see the consequences of the use of the weapon. We don't have any opportunity to collect at least some evidences, at least some fragments of the projectile, and we cannot safely say it was some specific kind of weapon used. And at the same time, if we investigate the events that were unfolding afterwards, we were working with the witnesses, with the victims, those who were subsequently exchanged during the prisoners' exchanges with the aggressor, and based on our investigation we were able to establish that the command of the colony being in cahoots with each other and other still unidentified representatives of the Federal Enforcement Service. They intentionally were committing actions, or they were failing to act intentionally to increase the number of victims. We know that the number of the Azov servicemen died, as it was already mentioned, due to the failure to provide medical aid to them. It's again, as it was mentioned, a part of that effort to prohibit provision of any medical aid by the medics who were held captive in the same barracks. So it resulted in death of at least 9 more Azov servicemen. And back then, the so-called commander of the Olenivka colony was indicted in absentia of violation of the rules of war connected with intentional murder. Thank you very much. Do we have any chances to really identify those who were committing that act of terrorism? Well, you see, we're moving in this direction, but for all of the Ukrainians, it's important to identify all of those involved and to hold them accountable. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your involvement in investigation of this crime, because we really need to take joint efforts to make sure that those who are guilty are held accountable. As my colleague have said, for the time being, the prosecution is still underway in relation to 2 persons, and currently the evidences are being collected to bring all of the persons involved to liability. Also, the investigation considers a number of versions of the crime. First of all, we've examined the weapons based on the photo and video materials that popped up online after the act of terrorism. And it was identified that one of the reasons of explosion was the use of the handheld flamethrower Shmel, which uses the thermobaric shells. Well, some of the bodies in the footage were burned so severely that it can evidence the use of thermobaric weapons. Also, no shrapnel of shells was identified in the site. This is what we were able to establish so far. Also, the investigation considers another version with the use of a high-precision artillery with thermobaric shells. Also, the colleagues were mentioning that before the explosion in the barracks itself, the people staying there were hearing 2 explosions nearby, and the third one directly hit the barracks and has taken many lives. Also, we, based on the words of the witnesses, think that it could be just an artillery shelling. Also, the witnesses mentioned that they were involved in collection of fragments that were remaining after the explosion. And one person reported that they've collected a number of shrapnels made of copper. Other persons report that they were seeing different fragments of different types of shells. Also, the investigation considers another version according to which the explosion was installed inside of the barracks near the entrance, not far from the epicenter of explosion. There was a vessel containing oil, according to the evidences from the witnesses, which resulted in intense fire that spread over all of the barracks right after the explosion. Investigation takes all of the necessary and possible efforts to establish the guilty parties and to bring them to liability. Thank you very much. In your opinion, what are the prospects of the case investigation by the International Criminal Court? In your opinion, can all of those guilty, can all of those who were committing this crime be held accountable? Well, obviously, shouldn't we be convinced that ICC has relevant jurisdiction, that they have capabilities for such investigation? We would hardly spend a year of our work to prepare that report. We are convinced, and we urge the Office of the Prosecutor General to start the investigation to establish all of those guilty of this crime. Just a small detail. Our position and the position of the Prosecutor General's office may be a little bit different, and it's normal because we're not having our hands tied with, say, procedures, so to say. We are free to provide the evidences to the ICC prosecutors, but in order not to complicate the work at initial phases, we were considering only one version, the use of thermobaric weapons, and we report so to the Office of Prosecutors General. Well, when it comes to the direct executioners of the crime, we were not able to establish their personalities so far. But when it comes to the colony command, there are indictments about the torture and failure to provide medical aid after the explosion. And it's easier here with the names of those who were directly involved in the crime. But again, it emphasizes the role of the Federal Enforcement Service of the Russian Federation and the Investigation Committee of Russian Federation as commanders who are directly liable of this crime, because the head of the colony were directly reporting to the head of the so-called enforcement service of the so-called DPR. And when it comes to Sergei Surovikin, he again is liable for the actions of his subordinates, and he should be brought to liability based on the Article 28 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So again, I'm convinced that sooner or later the office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court will get involved in this case. Thank you very much, Mr. Roman. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions on the floor?
Questions. First simple question is, how many defenders are currently getting medical treatment after bringing them home? And then most important is, what is the Western coverage looking like? I know Ukrainian press will discuss this, or press specifically about Ukraine, but what about Western media like BBC, New York Times, CNN, etc.? What traction are you getting in the story? Дякую.
Тема висвітлення цього теракту в міжнародному.
The topic of coverage in foreign media, to what extent is this topic covered in the key foreign media? Well, I can say that the foreign media have shown interest to these events, and they continue showing their interest. As we were analyzing the case, the journalist investigation, were paying attention to the journalist investigations by BBC, and when it comes to the number of those wounded, basically all of those who were staying in the barracks, they were affected by the explosion to different degrees. They were all wounded. According to our estimates, it's more than 130 persons. Again, if we can believe the details that we were mentioned in the very beginning, 193 persons that were staying in the barracks, and then 43 persons who died immediately, plus 9 those who died due to the failure to provide medical aid. So it's about 140 of those who were surviving. So when it comes to the foreign media, we keep track of the coverage in the foreign media. They publish interviews with us, but what's missing, the stories of the prisoners of war, of the servicemen who were staying in those barracks. Well, you know, not from the angle of it being a war crime, the facts about the war crime. There are articles like that in foreign media, but for example, a biography of a person, for example, during when we celebrate a birthday of every single serviceman who died in that act of terrorism, we publish that just a human story. If any of the foreign media is interested, we would be happy to share those stories. Well, a couple of more details. Well, first of all, when it comes to the prospects of investigation, the hearing of case in The Hague, the media initiative for human rights were taking a broad perspective at the problem. We understand that Russian Federation doesn't adhere to any rules. They don't comply with Geneva Convention specifically, and we understand that. Generally, Russian Federation keeps our prisoners of war in terrible conditions. They torture them everywhere, even when it comes to the places of detention that we're not aware about, like the torturing of different degree is happening on a daily basis, usually behind the closed doors, just like it was happening in Olenivka when nobody had any access to the places of detention, neither Red Cross nor the monitoring missions. It can be viewed generally as a crime, torturing and killing of the prisoners of war. We're not only talking about Olenivka, but Illusion 76 too. We're talking about dozens, hundreds of bodies of Ukrainian prisoners of war, which are being brought from the places of detention during the exchange of bodies. It's really important to view this problem in a complex perspective. When it comes to the number of those wounded, we think that after the explosion, everybody who was staying in the barracks 100, barracks 200, number 200, I think some of them were injured, some of them were brought to the hospital in Donetsk, and some of those wounded were staying in the isolator. About 70 of persons, about 70 were brought to the hospital, and about 70 more were staying in the isolator. They were wounded too. It's just that their injuries were lighter. Well, they were considered to have lighter injuries during the so-called screening of the injured. Now, Russian Federation continues holding dozens of the servicemen from those barracks captive. We don't know the whereabouts of a number of them. Russian Federation keeps moving them. Many of the servicemen are staying in the confinement cell of Taganrog. We also know about the illegal prosecution of Azov warriors from barracks 200. There are hearings in the Rostov court held over the Azov servicemen from barracks 200. The last report was about the serviceman Maximchuk, who made a statement about the systemic torturing. Many people from Olenivka were getting to Taganrog, were transported to Taganrog. Further on, they were tortured. They were tortured in attempt to get evidences from them. So when it comes to the crime in Olenivka, this crime is still continuing. It's continuing now at this minute, and if we don't bring those guilty ones to liability, Russia will continue living behind the closed doors, behind which they can do everything they want. There is another question on the floor. Good morning. Thank you for the great job you're doing. Thank you for making all these things public, because people don't know about what others don't talk. Well, I would like to ask you about the investigation. I think due to the multitude of versions of explosion that we've heard, I'm having a question. Have you investigated the satellite images of that location, because they can give some answers to the question whether it was an artillery shelling that is characterized by major destruction, or was it the use of the Shmel flamethrower, the consequences of use of which may be of internal nature. So to say, can you share this information with us, those details? Thank you. I think that's a question for the representatives of the Prosecutor General's office. Well, during the pre-court investigation, we were investigating the satellite images. We were looking for any option. We were investigating images from international organizations, foreign organizations, and based on what we were able to investigate, well, we've searched the territory 40 kilometers from the colony. So the maximum distance of MLRS, potential MLRS shelling, unfortunately, we were not able to identify any signs or traces of use of artillery, because during that period the number of satellite images was real sparse, and based on them we were unable to get any additional details. The investigation of those satellite images was held in a complex manner, and we were trying to investigate all possible options. Well, if I'm allowed, our results may differ a little bit, and it's normal because we're not having our hands tied with the procedural formalities. We were using all of the images that we were able to get. Well, I cannot tell you from where, but still, we've analyzed the images, and what we've seen really is more difficult with the explosion on the 28th, but there is certain story with what was going on before this date. So before May 2022, it was a territory like 10 or 11 kilometers to the forward edge of the battle area. So again, it's a question, why would the prisoners of war be brought to Olenivka, so close to the forward edge of the battle area? Well, any projectile could just randomly land there accidentally, but before May 2022, the shells in that sector were quite intense from both sides, both from Ukrainian armed forces and Russian Federation. However, starting from April, middle of April, when the camp resumed its activity, the intensity of shellings by the armed forces of Ukraine has fallen significantly, and when it comes to the territory which is adjacent to the camp itself, no damage was observed in that area produced by the Ukrainian armed forces. So as soon as Ukrainians found out that the prisoners of war are being moved to that colony, they've ceased any activities that could result in potential shelling of that area. One interesting detail, and again, based on the analysis of the satellite images that we've got, starting from the beginning of May, the activity of the armed forces of Russian Federation in that area intensified significantly, 400, 600 meters away from the site of colony. And what could be observed, the launch of Grad rockets. Their positions were located 1 kilometer and a half from the territory of the colony, and in our opinion, it was intended to provoke the response from the armed forces of Ukraine that could potentially result in the damage of the colony. Thank you very much. We have more questions on the floor. Thank you very much. Olena Matsuska, TSN 1+1. I'm having a question of a procedural nature. What is the further procedure after application to ICC? Are you getting any feedback? Well, I'm thinking the Office of Prosecutor General was reporting to the ICC about the fact of the act of terrorism in Olenivka. So is there any cooperation, any exchange of information, any information requests submitted from Prosecutor's office to ICC or the other way around? So let's start with you, sir. Well, thank you for the question. We are in close cooperation with the ICC on a confidential basis, and unfortunately, I cannot share any information about such cooperation with you. I mean, are they even aware of Olenivka, or have they found out about that fact from the civil society organizations? Well, talking about procedure is the same that with other cases when, for example, the warrants in the name of Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova were issued. So basically, the Office of the Prosecutor of ICC is supposed to make a decision on whether the investigation will be held by the Prosecutor's office. If so, then following phase is the issue of the warrants. We don't know whether the result will be the same as in the case with Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, because usually the public is not being made aware of the issue of any warrants. It was just such a exclusion in the case of Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova when the public was made aware about any such warrants. And should the prosecutor take such a resolution, then the circle of the parties involved will be identified, and they will see whether the case should be considered by the ICC itself. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of our participants, all of our panelists, and all those who work on identifying the criminals and bringing them to liability. And obviously, I would like to thank our security and defense forces, our armed forces, thanks to whom we can gather here and continue working together for our victory. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.